Welcome to the Inquiry 1.0. Today we have an upload on Glasgow Hardman, Jimmy Costello, and his altercation with the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe. Now, before we get started, guys, can you please smash the likes out there? It helps get the algorithm out there, which brings more people involved and able to listen to this free at the point of use content. With that being said, let's get cracking. As a kid, Glasgow Hardman Costello talks about himself being a nice, quiet boy, living in the countryside with his parents. Unfortunately for young Jimmy, his parents, for some reason, didn't want him and sent him to a reform school in Glasgow, a tough, uncompromising place that set him on his path of violence. Traumatised by bullies, Costello one day decided enough was enough and flipped on one nasty bully, beating him to the ground with a ferocious volley of punches. This episode was a great learning lesson and turning point for Jimmy Costello. In his mind, he would no longer be a victim. He now realised the great power that violence wielded and was determined to master the dark art. Following on from reform school, Costello earned his stripes the hard way, participating in street gang battles with razors, hatchets, axes, and all the tools you can imagine. Glasgow in the 60s and 70s had ferocious street gangs that carved up sections of the city by geography, as had been the case for decades. There was a difference now, though, as the infamous Walter Novell realised on his release from prison in '67. Walter Novell, perhaps the godfather of Glasgow crime, on his release from prison, saw that small-town gangs had morphed into more sophisticated crime gangs, interested now in making money as well as inflicting violence on rivals. The razor gangs of the past were violent, but not sophisticated in terms of criminality. There were numerous gangs from all corners of the city. However, perhaps the most famous was the Cart and Tongs in the East End of Glasgow that Costello had become a member of, drinking, fighting, selling drugs, and womanising. For decades, the Calton Tongs, the original Tongs, were one of the most feared and infamous to come out of the city. So much so that when they finally appeared to have met their demise in 2011, after running a reign of terror throughout the East End for generations, Police Scotland felt necessary to mark the occasion by issuing a press release celebrating the death of the young team, dubbed Scotland's most violent gang. The Tongs had more influence and control over their patch than any other street gang in the country, leading to the area becoming known as Tongland, while their infamous chant of Tong Jabas became a slogan for a generation of young teams and gang members in the west of Scotland. The East End crime bosses like Novell tapped into the potential of these street gangs to do their dirty work and set up drug networking. Jimmy Costello relished the notoriety and progressed quickly from a feared violent street thug to respected hardman face of the Glasgow underworld. No longer just a street thug, he had catapulted into the big time, making serious money from criminality. Unknown to Costello at the time, he also suffered from mental health issues, which perhaps added or fueled his violent ways. Without doubt, the mental issues developed due to his extremely violent life on the streets and the habitual drug taking from mind altering drugs. In an interview, Costello said of himself, "It felt good because I got respect. That was the first bad lesson I learned. The next was carrying a chib and running with the gangs. I became a hard man, the one who made all the others blink. I was young and wild. I thieved, drank, and fought. I was arrested frequently for carrying weapons. They put me in prison, but the word rehabilitation never came up. And I felt secure in my growing notoriety. Being in command was good, except that I see now that I wasn't in command. It had taken me years to understand not only the harm the gangs did to me, but the harm I then caused other people. I realised now that I was not a hard man. I was a bad man, a sick man. I took pride in being violent. There is nothing to be proud of in being violent." Jimmy Costello took the violence from the streets into prisons, carrying out chib hits on informers for as much as £500 a time, and fought the system all the way, attacking screws and cons alike if they crossed him. Costello was invariably in prison more than on the streets, as his unpredictable behaviour spiralled out of control. He did get married and father a son, but by the 80s his life was one of violence and habitual drug taking, with cocktails of LSD, speed and dope, which was sending him delirious with paranoia. By this time, He had made 28 court appearances, 9 of them in relation to violence, and 15 appearances resulting in prison sentences. He had been convicted in 1980 for possessing a firearm with the intent to endanger life, possessing a firearm with intent to resist arrest, and possessing a firearm without a certification. He had received a 10-year sentence. Whilst in Parker's prison, Costello had been diagnosed as mentally ill and was awaiting transfer to Broadmoor. At this time, he happened to be on the same wing as the evil Peter Sutcliffe. Peter William Sutcliffe was an English serial killer who was dubbed the Yorkshire Ripper by the press. Sutcliffe was convicted of murdering 13 women and attempting to murder 7 others between 1975 and 1980. He was sentenced to 20 concurrent sentences of life imprisonment, which were converted to a whole life order in 2010. 2 of Sutcliffe's murders took place in Manchester and all the others were in West Yorkshire. The attack took place while Peter Sutcliffe was getting water in a plastic bowl. Jimmy Costello entered the recess, and as Sutcliffe turned to leave, he smashed him twice on the left side of the face with a broken coffee jar before Sutcliffe managed to push him away. Sutcliffe had 4 wounds requiring 30 stitches. One deep cut ran 5 inches from near his mouth to his neck, and another was 2.5 inches long, running from his left eye to his ear. He also had 2 smaller cuts on the eyelid and below the eye. Sutcliffe had lost about a pint of blood and had gone into a mild state of shock. He required an operation to repair superficial muscle damage. Costello talks about the aftermath of the attack and his issues with mental health and being dubbed a psychopath in an interview with the Daily Record in 1996. He said, "I was sentenced to 5 years for attacking him. I was moved to Rampton Hospital, where I spent 2 years fighting all the way, taking the vicious injections that KO the rowdy patients. I was lying in my strip cell when I heard my ma say, 'Sorry, Jim.' This wasn't drug-induced. She was real to me, even though she was 12,000 miles away in Australia. I felt like I was tripping, but I wasn't. At last I accepted I was ill. My original diagnosis at Broadmoor was that I was a psychopath. The consultant read this out in court and it was taken up by the newspapers, which was degrading. I felt Sutcliffe was a psycho, but not me. I hadn't slaughtered all those women. But then I was re-diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic when I admitted hearing voices. I was moved from Rampton to Park Lane in Liverpool, where I spent 4 years and had intense psychoanalysis. My original diagnosis at Broadmoor was that I was a psychopath. The consultant read this out in court. Of course, as I've said, I found this degrading. I was discharged in November 1990. I wanted to be free of violence. I lived the life of a recluse in Watford until I cracked. I went into my GP's surgery and stabbed him and slashed a second doctor. Other doctors and patients heard the screams and came to help. I was held down until the police arrived. I came here on April 10, 1995 and faced 4 charges: malicious wounding, GBH, ABH, and possession of a knife. I was sentenced to be held without limit of time. A mixed soup lies within me. I'm still proud of the way I rose through the ranks from a small town gang member to a big face. But I'm also ashamed of my behaviour, especially towards the doctors. They weren't grasses or screws who had harmed me. Being in the gangs in Glasgow taught me to use guns, knives, bottles, meat cleavers. It has lost me everything, including my family. My son, now 16, is an English international schoolboy footballer, but I would never see him play. He can't even use my name because Costello is not a name anyone can be proud of. But I love him and tell him so. He loves me and tells me. My stepdaughter loves me and tells me, and I love her. I never heard the word love used as a child, but I made certain my weans knew I loved them. The late Ron Craig gave me a write-up in his autobiography, My Story. But this is not really my story, any more than Small Faces is the real story. Reality for men who became as violent as me is here. Detention without limit of time. That is my life. That is real. Okay, guys, so that was the story of Jimmy Costello. I researched it through different period articles, archives, anecdotes, and several books. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it's relatively accurate. I do try and do a lot of research and put things together. But if as per usual, in the comments, if any of you guys knew Jimmy personally or have got different stories or different anecdotes, please feel free to let me know in the comments. All right, guys, take care. Have a fantastic day.